When you encounter an attractive man on the street, you'll never guess what he's thinking while looking at you. Could it be admiration, curiosity, indifference, or a desire to cook you up deliciously? After putting her baby daughter to bed, the woman turned on her computer. She wanted to take a brief break from the daily hustle and household chores. Imagine her astonishment when she discovered her own bikini photo on some peculiar unknown website. But that wasn't even the most shocking part, as the woman began reading user comments that predicted a rather tragic end for her. They suggested chloroforming her, binding her, gagging her mouth, and kidnapping her, only to butcher her like an animal carcass and make kebabs. The woman couldn't believe her eyes, gripped by horror and incredible fear for her life. Yet these weren't all the revelations she was about to uncover. Today's story revolves around a person named Gilberto Valle, who once swore to serve New York's residents and protect them from dangers. He was known to friends and colleagues as a dedicated police officer, but Gilberto led a sinister double life that stunned everyone. The media dubbed him the Cannibal Cop, and his arrest exposed an entire network of twisted fantasies and detailed plans that had been brewing in his mind. Whether Gilberto was a monster or just an ordinary person with a terrifying imagination, we'll try to determine today. Gilberto Valle was born on April 14, 1984, and lived with his family in a peaceful, secure neighborhood in Queens, New York. He was the eldest child in the family. His parents frequently quarreled and ultimately separated when Gilberto, their oldest son, was 5 years old. In elementary school, Gilberto was a quiet, shy child, but as he grew older, he gained many friends and became popular. The boy performed well academically and played baseball from age 11. Even then, he began having frequent thoughts about girls, but his private fantasies differed from those of most adolescents. Gilberto discovered he always dreamed about girls and imagined them restrained and helpless. This particularly fascinated him. Gilberto attended a Catholic high school and played on the baseball team, receiving a small scholarship. His youth coincided with the 90s, when many children first encountered the internet. It was an exciting and thrilling time to log into the system and present yourself as a completely different person, and nobody would ever know who you really were. You could be whoever you wanted. This was how Gilberto immersed himself in the World Wide Web and spent many hours in various chat rooms with random people until he eventually stumbled upon adult content. This was truly a shocking discovery for a teenager of that era. In high school, Gilberto first fell for a girl named Melanie, and they became good friends. The boy wanted more, but Melanie was only interested in friendship. So the pair spent their days together, walking and talking about everything under the sun. But in the dark nights, Gilberto would fantasize about this girl. In his fantasies, she was always bound, helpless, and gagged. After finishing high school, Gilberto enrolled in college to pursue a psychology degree. As his minor, the young man chose criminal justice. Gilberto studied well, received excellent grades, and praise from professors. Though later the young man admitted that focusing on lessons was very difficult, because the girls around him were simply magnificent. And each time he imagined restraining them, then cooking them on a grill like turkeys. These were the peculiar fantasies this young man had. Fortunately, they remained only in his mind. Generally, Gilberto was a typical student, attending parties, playing pranks on friends, and meeting girls. But he never became intimate with any of them. In his free time from studies, the young man spent time on the computer, searching for sites with various unconventional interests. That's how he found a fetish site centered on consuming human flesh. It was on this site that Gilberto learned many new things. For instance, that he wasn't alone and there were others around dreaming of similar things. Then he met users who wrote fictional stories about their private preferences. Some of the stories were quite graphic and included elaborate desires about capturing and preparing victims. After discovering such websites, Gilberto no longer worried there was something wrong with him, and he stopped considering himself abnormal. However, He didn't share his dreams with anyone, keeping them secret. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. In 2006, after receiving his diploma from the University of Maryland, the young professional returned to his father's house and applied to serve in the New York Police Department. It was necessary to have an interview with a psychologist to ensure that Gilberto was mentally fit to work in the police force. Naturally, he tactfully remained silent about his private inclinations, understanding that he could be misunderstood. During police training, rookies were often sent to patrol the toughest districts of the city to immediately identify the weak ones. It was quite demanding work, but Gilberto handled it excellently. In his free time from work, he continued visiting his favorite websites and many different forums related to his private dreams. New photos and new stories were uploaded there daily. Once Gilberto even thought about contributing and writing some personal story, but then decided not to risk it, fearing that someone he knew might read his revelation. In 2009, Gilberto created a profile on a dating site to find a girlfriend. But things never went beyond a couple of dates. Then he began searching for a partner on social networks, but instead stumbled upon a website that touched him deeply. The website's welcome page had the following message: "Welcome to the social network, where you won't feel like an outcast because of your dark interest, because this place was created specifically for people like you. Feel free to look around, meet crazy in a good way people, and become part of our adult community. Please remember that this place is dedicated only to your fantasies and nothing else." Gilberto realized this was exactly what he had been looking for. He registered and created the username Girl Meet Hunter. In his profile description, he indicated that he was interested in fantasies involving kidnapping people, abuse, and consuming human flesh. One of the website's entertainments was to take a photo of a random person from social networks and post it on your page with the question of what would you do with them. And all visitors would write their most hidden desires in the comments, some of which were terrible and graphic. But fortunately, these were just fantasies. Gilberto really enjoyed participating and expressing himself in such online games. Sometimes he even posted photos of his former classmates and proposed discussing their candidacies. During these years, each of Gilberto's days was similar to the next. He lived at his father's house, worked a lot, occasionally went on dates, and then spent his free time on interest websites. This continued until the man met a girl named Kathleen Mangan. By this point, Gilberto was already 25 years old, and by his own admission, he still had not had an intimate connection with women. Caitlin had recently arrived in New York and secured a job as a teacher in an elementary school. On their first date, the young couple discovered they had much in common and had been inseparable ever since. From the very first meeting, Caitlin Megan became the main character in Gilberto's intimate fantasies. He imagined forcibly abducting her against her will, binding her, baking her, and then placing Caitlin on a large platter with an apple in her mouth. Naturally, the guy did not share this with his girlfriend, not wanting to frighten her. But in his thoughts, he constantly envisioned such scenes. A couple of weeks after meeting, Gilberto officially began courting Caitlin. After a year of acquaintance, they moved in together and started living in a small apartment in Manhattan. Soon, their family expanded when they got a bulldog, because Caitlin adored this particular breed. Even her college mascot had been a bulldog. The first years of their relationship were positive. The lovers laughed and joked a lot. According to Caitlin, Gilberto was very sweet, respectful towards women, and never quarreled with anyone. She knew absolutely nothing about his online interests and did not even suspect his secret and intimate fantasies. In January 2011, Caitlin learned she was pregnant. But Gilberto's initial reaction to his partner's pregnancy was negative because he primarily thought about financial issues. The emergence of an infant frightened the man. He was afraid to take responsibility for a small life, but after getting somewhat accustomed to the idea of becoming a father, he and Caitlin sat down and discussed all their concerns. The future parents tried to encourage each other and assure themselves that together they would manage. And soon after a few months, the man was eagerly awaiting the birth of his firstborn and even attempted to read specialized literature for future parents. Gilberto and Caitlin moved to a larger apartment in Forest Hills, and in September 2011, they had a girl. The new parents chose a beautiful name for her, Josephine. The birth of a daughter did not mean that Valle abandoned his secret interests. He still spent much time on a fetishist website and had become quite a well-known personality there. Site visitors enjoyed reading his fantasies. The man even gained online friends from this community. The following year, Gilberto passed the sergeant exam and completely immersed himself in work. Caitlin transformed into a housewife and looked after the baby. Eventually, they got married, having lived in a civil union for a long time. Josephine's appearance necessitated legalizing their relationship. It seemed everything would improve, but their marriage could not be called happy, as Gilberto was always working and came home exhausted. All childcare responsibilities fell on his wife's shoulders. After the child's birth, there was no intimacy in their relationship. No matter how Caitlin tried to seduce her husband, it always ended with him running to the bathroom, unable to complete the sexual act. And after some time, Gilberto simply began avoiding intimacy with his wife. He would come home from work and play video games, watch television, or just sit on the internet until 3 to 4 in the morning. He would go to bed only after Caitlin had fallen asleep, tired of waiting for his return. After a tense workday at the police department, the man wanted to relax, not listen to his wife's reproaches or face her disapproving look. One day, Gilberto's computer broke down. While it was being fixed, he decided to use Kathleen's computer. Initially, he resisted using it to visit certain websites. He worried the data would be saved and his wife would discover his browsing history. But apparently, desire won out one day and Gilberto let his guard down. Not only did he visit these peculiar websites from his wife's computer, but he also forgot to close his tabs. When Gilberto was at work, Kathleen put their daughter to sleep and decided to spend some time online to unwind from the daily routine. She opened the browser and discovered disturbing images and concerning user comments. The woman was shocked by what she found. While she had previously blamed herself for their intimate life problems, thinking she wasn't appealing enough, now Kathleen understood there was something else entirely going on. When her husband returned from work, she decided to have a serious conversation with him. Kathleen told Gilberto the truth about discovering the websites he visited in his free time. However, she wasn't planning to judge him, but merely suggested they try together to revitalize their marriage. The woman hoped this conversation would be a breakthrough for them, but somewhere deep down, she understood this wasn't the whole truth about her husband. At one point, Kathleen suspected Gilberto was unfaithful. Her understanding was that only a relationship with another woman could pull her husband away from his marital duties, so she decided to install monitoring software on his computer to see what he did online when she wasn't around. What she discovered was far worse than her initial suspicions. The very next day, Kathleen was able to see all the websites her spouse visited and his correspondence with new acquaintances from different countries. And that's when she truly became frightened. There were photos of acquaintances and friends with disturbing comments. And then in her husband's correspondence with one person, Kathleen saw her own face and messages where they discussed in detail what they planned to do with her. Binding her legs, cutting her throat, and watching the blood flow. This was just one of the quotes that stunned the woman. She couldn't even imagine such horrors. Yet here was her own husband having such discussions about her fate. The entire correspondence seemed so real that Kathleen became convinced her husband intended to actually do this to her. She was so frightened that she packed her things that same day, and left with their daughter to her parents in Nevada. She didn't even want to hear her husband's explanation. When the initial wave of fear subsided, Kathleen decided to use the monitoring software again to see what her husband was now discussing with his new acquaintances. Kathleen again found disturbing content. Additionally, the woman checked her husband's browser history. Gilberto had searched for methods of causing harm, and also searched for recipes involving human flesh. In correspondence with his online friends, Gilberto discussed preparing a woman in olive oil over an open fire and using her severed head as a centerpiece for the feast. Just imagining this made Kathleen feel ill. She learned many more shocking details about her spouse that day thanks to the monitoring software. Kathleen saw a whole folder of photographs of various women, both familiar and unfamiliar, more than 80 in total. She read messages where her husband and other site visitors discussed various methods of abduction and other disturbing acts. He was very active and chatted with approximately 24 different users. The more Kathleen investigated Gilberto's computer, the worse she felt, because in the electronic correspondence, she herself was the main intended victim. The woman now knew what her husband and his correspondents planned to do with her, and thanked God she managed to escape in time. In reality, in several letters, Gilberto mentioned that all of this was nothing more than fantasies, hidden desires, and none of the above would happen in real life. But Kathleen, being in a state of extreme horror and panic, didn't notice this. She concluded that her husband was dangerous and needed to be stopped immediately. The woman contacted authorities and presented them with all these disturbing messages. She also told them that according to the correspondence, Gilberto was planning to abduct her and end her life. On October 24, 2012, a group of FBI agents headed to Gilberto's apartment in Forest Hills to make an arrest. The agents didn't want police officer Gilberto to resist, or worse, start a shootout. They called him on the phone and said someone had hit his parked car. A confused Gilberto, wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, came out of the house and immediately found himself surrounded by FBI agents. The man was placed under arrest, charged with conspiracy to abduct and harm others. He ultimately spent 5 months behind bars awaiting trial. During the investigation, the FBI identified specific emails in which Gilberto had devised strategies and planned to make them real. Additionally, agents checked Gilberto's work computer and discovered that the officer had used software available to him as a law enforcement officer for personal purposes, illegally accessing the police database. All this pointed to Gilberto's specific intent to commit a crime. While Gilberto awaited the start of the trial, details of his correspondence began to surface. The media focused on the story of a husband secretly planning to abduct several women, including his own wife, Kathleen. Once the media caught wind of this story, all the hidden conversations emerged and caused a significant stir. The Cannibal Cop, that's what reporters dubbed him. The identities of his associates, with whom Gilberto exchanged correspondence, photographs, and stories about what he would do to various women, became known to the general public. The FBI identified 3 specific individuals with whom Gilberto communicated in recent months. These were Michael Van Hees, a 22-year-old auto mechanic from southern New Jersey, Dale Bollinger, a British national, and a man from Pakistan named Ali Khan. It was with these pen pals that Gilberto conducted preparations for a future abduction in January 2012. Gilberto sent Michael Van Hees an email with photographs of a woman named Alicia, with whom they worked together, and Michael offered to abduct her for Gilberto for $5,000. The police officer, putting his law enforcement career at risk, demanded assurance that the woman would never be found after the abduction. Otherwise, he would face significant problems. All this discussion clearly indicated planned criminal activities. Around the same time, Gilberto corresponded with Ali Khan and proposed taking his wife Caitlin on a trip to Pakistan, where they would together end her life and prepare her for dinner. Subsequently, Gilberto sent Ali a photograph of Caitlin in a bikini and boasted about how appetizing she looked. With his third friend, the Briton Dale, Gilberto discussed dealing with his former college friend named Andrea. The man wanted to make her suffer and beg for help. As later discovered, Dale was already constructing a special device in his basement to suspend a woman by her feet. Gilberto bragged to his friends that his house had an oven large enough to accommodate a victim. Furthermore, Gilberto knew of a location in the mountains where there was no one for miles around. They could transport a woman of their choice there and do whatever they desired with her. The conspirators focused on one of Gilberto's college friends, a woman named Kimberly. FBI agents obtained a Word document where they discussed abducting and preparing Kimberly. Gilberto listed materials he would need to carry out this task. For example, the list included strong rope, chloroform, a gag, tape, and then tarp or plastic bags to protect the trunk from any DNA evidence. Gilberto used the NYPD database to search for detailed information about various women he knew who were targets of his discussions. The searches typically included basic information such as home address, date of birth, height, weight, bust size, eye color, criminal records, and more. Prosecutors considered Gilberto's plans to be more than just disturbed fantasies. Unfortunately, or fortunately, during the apartment search, they found no physical evidence indicating he was preparing to abduct or cook anyone. The oven in his kitchen was standard size. No chloroform, gags, or rope were found in the house either. There were also no coordinates of the secluded mountain location Gilberto had written to his friends about. So whether this was all just fantasy, or if an abduction was actually being planned, remained to be determined. On December 31, 2012, attorneys requested a court psychiatrist conduct a psychiatric evaluation of their client. The doctor's task was to determine and express an opinion on how real Gilberto's web persona was and whether it could manifest in real life. In other words, if there were preconditions for this. The doctor had already reviewed Gilberto's questionnaire that he completed when applying to the police department. The psychological test, containing numerous questions, was typically used as a tool to assess personality traits and identify mental pathologies. It was used to check the future employees' stress resistance and evaluate their level of preparedness for work. The conversation with the psychotherapist lasted for 3 days, totaling about 18 hours. Gilberto openly discussed everything related to his intimate life, starting from his teenage years. The man explained that he had always been quite shy and embarrassed to tell anyone about the thoughts that came into his head. When he began sharing his interests with strangers on the internet, he was caught up in a wave and couldn't stop. Everyone waited for the doctor to answer the main question. Could Gilberto Valle's fantasies manifest in real life? Could this person have been preparing an actual abduction and subsequent harm to his own wife, and all these women whose photos appeared in his correspondence? According to the doctor, Officer Gilberto had no mental disorders and created the impression of a very pleasant, positive person. He did indeed have unusual and even criminal fantasies, but there was a huge gap between them and their real-world implementation. The psychotherapist was confident that for Gilberto, it was enough to talk with someone and fantasize about this topic, but he didn't seem like a person who could begin to act. The doctor found no concerning precursors in his behavior. This was exactly the expert conclusion the attorneys were waiting for, ready to present at the trial in Gilberto's defense. Gilberto went on trial in February 2013. 2 different cases with 1 defendant were discussed. The former police officer faced life imprisonment on charges of conspiracy to kidnap, and a maximum of 5 years for unauthorized access to the Federal National Crime Information Center database. The uniqueness of this case lay in the fact that all evidence used against Gilberto was based on his thoughts and fantasies documented in correspondence with friends. The defense team emphasized that while the defendant's interests and discussions were disturbing and even repulsive, ultimately they weren't criminal. nothing illegal had actually occurred. Most of the charges centered on emails exchanged between Gilberto and his friends from the fetish club. In response to the accusations, attorneys showed Gilberto's profile on the website cited by prosecutors, where it was written that the author was only expressing his own fantasies and nothing more. The defense team also tried to prove that Gilberto made plans, but never acted on them. This was evident from letters where the men planned to abduct 3 different women on President's Day. The holiday had long passed, but all potential victims were alive and well. The harm remained only in the minds and correspondence of the would-be criminals. The prosecution, in turn, portrayed Gilberto as a man who had lost control. They mentioned the fact that the defendant used the NYPD database to search for women's addresses, and this was evidence that he was planning to take action. Gilberto's wife testified against him. After this, she obtained a divorce, took their young daughter, and completely cut off all contact with her ex-husband and his family. Throughout the trial, Gilberto himself maintained that the chat messages were merely fantasy and that he had no intention of acting on them. The situation was ambiguous. The prosecutor gave the jury an example to consider. He compared Gilberto's fantasies to those of a chef who dreamed of poisoning his clients. If they learned that the chef of their favorite restaurant was day and night searching the internet for poisons, telling his friends how he planned to slip poison into some patron's food, would they still go to the restaurant? After all, the chef would call these just his dark fantasies. The trial of Officer Gilberto lasted just over a month. On March 12, 2013, the jury returned with a verdict and found Gilberto guilty of conspiracy to kidnap and harm others. He was also convicted on the second count related to illegally accessing and using law enforcement databases for personal purposes. The guilty verdict also led to his dismissal from the police force. Many of Gilberto's team and family members disagreed with the verdict. It appeared the man was being prosecuted for his fantasies and dark thoughts. At this point, Gilberto hadn't done anything that violated the law, and prosecuting him for unconventional desires was considered wrong and too harsh. Nevertheless, the jurors were convinced that sooner or later the defendant would have broken the law and harmed at least one of the intended victims. His fantasies were like an addiction that would require a larger and larger dose each time. It all ended with Gilberto Valle filing an appeal against his sentence shortly after it was handed down. More than 12 months later, in June 2014, a federal district court judge overturned Gilberto's conviction for conspiracy and intended harm, stating there wasn't sufficient evidence to support it. The evidence suggested that the internet messages about kidnapping women were most likely a fantasy role-playing game. That's exactly how the judge characterized Gilberto's correspondence. By that time, Gilberto had spent 21 months in confinement. He was released from prison to house arrest in his mother's apartment. Bail was set at $100,000. Under the terms of release, Gilberto had to wear an electronic ankle monitor. He was prohibited from using the internet. The former New York police officer smiled at his family and embraced his attorneys while leaving the courtroom. He took advantage of the reporter's presence to apologize to anyone who was hurt, shocked, or offended by his immature actions. Outwardly, the former officer gave the impression of being a highly dedicated servant of the law. He was respected on duty and had never received any complaints about his work. In photographs, Gilberto frequently smiled, showing everyone his playful nature and leaving positive impressions. Colleagues said he could find a reason to laugh in any situation and cheer up everyone around him. And in December 2015, the Second Circuit Court affirmed the decision to overturn the conviction for unauthorized access to law enforcement databases. All criminal charges against Gilberto were dismissed. His attorney stated that this ruling was a crucial victory not only for Officer Gilberto, but also for society as a whole, which valued freedom of thought and expression. However, this story had positive outcomes. The FBI obtained substantial information about other potential criminals, all thanks to the illegal website. On January 4, 2013, they arrested Michael Vangus, who admitted to police that he harbored violent, intimate fantasies, some involving minors. His wife told reporters that she learned about his fetishes before they married and that she had accepted it calmly. Then, 2 more men who spent time on the fetishist website were arrested. These were Richard Melt, a 65-year-old former police chief in Bedford, Massachusetts, and Robert Ashe, a 61-year-old former high school librarian. The librarian had previously faced charges for inappropriate contact with 4 male students, but the charges were later dropped. Unlike Gilberto, these 2 men, Robert Ashe and Richard Melt, crossed the line. An undercover agent arranged a meeting with them, to which they brought a bag that was later found to contain a stun gun, skewers, and other items discussed in their correspondence. Investigators realized these 2 were clearly prepared to transform their fantasies into reality, so both were arrested and brought to court. Another of Gilberto's online correspondents, British citizen Dale Bollinger, was also detained by British authorities for harassing an underage schoolgirl. The man met a girl who was only 14 years old and arranged a meeting with her, before which he purchased an axe and brought it to the date. The fact was that in emails, he had told Gilberto about his fantasies about decapitating victims and then acquiring the tool before the date with the high school student. His actions were recognized as intent to cause bodily harm. So people who feared that someone with such inclinations might eventually snap and succumb to their dark desires were somewhat right. After his release, Gilberto tried to obtain custody of his daughter Josephine, or at least arrange visits with her, but Kathleen was against it. She said that their daughter would one day grow up to be a woman, and then her father's fantasies might extend to her. The man initially planned to contest this in court, but ultimately abandoned the case because there were too many legal expenses he couldn't afford. In 2017, Gilberto Valle gave an interview where, in his defense, he said that people don't choose what arouses them. He agreed that his messages about intimate preferences, described in correspondence with visitors to the fetishist website, indeed appeared strange and frightening to normal people. But it was never anything real. It was all just fiction. He served as a police officer and would never have committed crimes. Eventually, Gilberto found an outlet for himself in literature. In 2017, he wrote a memoir titled Raw Deal, the untold story of the Cannibal Cop from the New York Police. In 2018, Gilberto published another work, The Gathering Evil. The book's description states that the story tells of 2 young New York residents who become targets of a group of wealthy and influential people. Apparently, this is how Gilberto Valle managed to contain his dark fantasies, by putting them on paper. Because of his terrible secret, he lost his family and his police job, but gained questionable notoriety that allowed him to speak openly about his desires. The story of Gilberto Valle, the Cannibal Cop from New York, ended well for both the offender and his potential victims. However, it remains unknown whether he can continue to contain his dark fantasies. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.